Regional variants were meant to be a really exciting way to improve some older Pokemon while not necessarily taking away from any of these older Kanto forms that fans have really grown to love over the past couple decades. But honestly, most of these Pokemon ended up just being flops, with only 4 out of 10 ever holding relevancy in VGC, and 3 of these 4 ended up still falling out of relevance after just 1 year of VGC. Considering the second best example of an Alolan form has gotta be Alolan Muk, which has barely seen niche usage next to Smeargle with Power of Alchemy, as a really gimmicky strategy, I think it's time to buff some of these Alolan forms to make them a little bit more beneficial for your team in VGC. I will be ignoring Alolan Ninetales for this video because Alolan Ninetales has at several different points, especially in Scarlet and Violet since we've received the buff to Snow, been a legitimate contender for just a strong Pokemon in doubles, and I really don't think we need to be giving this any improvements whatsoever. But for the other 9, let's see what we could do to make them actually strong. While I'm only going to be talking about Alolan forms in this video, there are plenty of other regional variants we can cover, and if this video gets to 300 likes, I can cover another group of Pokemon that you guys want to see in VGC. Also, you guys should subscribe if you enjoy content like this, because I upload tons of different videos that are in a similar vein, where we try and make Pokemon either as good as possible in VGC through different means, or just talk about how good certain Pokemon have been over the years. Finally, if you guys want to choose the next group of Pokemon that we cover for a series like this, such as maybe buffing the Galar forms next, or even fossil Pokemon, make sure to hit the membership button, where just for a couple dollars a month, you get to vote on polls for videos like this, as well as you get access to emotes and badges next to your name. With all that out of the way though, let's start off by really quickly going over some guidelines for our Alolan forms today. So when I typically do these videos, one of the first things that people mention in the comments is how they don't typically like it when I min-max the stats on these Pokemon. So with this in mind, we're going to try and keep the Pokemon at only 500 BST today. Now there are a few Pokemon that will be breaking this rule, such as Alolan Exeggutor, which already has over 500 BST, but for the most part, we will be keeping them at roughly 500. While I know that a lot of these Pokemon are meant to mirror the Kanto forms stat-wise, at the same time though, we're not going to be making Alolan Raticate viable with just 413 BST, while without giving it an ability such as huge power or really truly min-maxing the stats. So with that in mind though, let's actually quickly go over how we managed to buff Alolan Raticate and the rest of our Alolan forms here. So one of the quickest ways to buff Alolan Raticate is honestly just to take a page out of the Kanto Raticate's book and change its ability from Hustle to Guts, which is probably the best ability that Kanto Raticate actually had in its arsenal. From here, we still have plenty of stats that we can improve because Alolan Raticate only has a base stat total of 413, so we have 87 extra points to work with. The majority of these are going to be in HP and speed, which are each going to increase by 30 points, which will allow Alolan Raticate to become a significantly bulkier and faster pick that'll now be able to take hits from Pokemon much easier and outpace threats like Garchomp, Salamence, and Urshifu, to name a very select few. On top of this, we're also going to give some minor stat buffs to both attack and physical defense, which I think will matter a lot less for Alolan Raticate now that it has Guts as an ability, but it'll still be a pretty impactful option nonetheless to raise this to base 88 attack. On top of this, I do want to add on a lot of new moves, since we need a new normal stab that's not just double edge, so we'll add on Body Slam here, as well as Drain Punch, which I think could be a pretty impactful option to hit steel types. Now you might be wondering why we're going to add on Body Slam, and that's because I want to give a normal stab that'll take advantage of the ability Gluttony, since we'll also be giving it the move Belly Drum, which will allow Alolan Raticate another means to set up very quickly, and Recycle that could be a very strong move to partner with the ability Gluttony, allowing it to just sustain health as much as possible by recycling the berry up every time you lose it. With Tara, this honestly could have been a really terrifying offensive win con, and with the partner like Clefairy or Amoonguss at its side, you could definitely get up a Belly Drum really easily for wall breaking through your opponent's team with your very powerful normal and dark type stab. I don't think this was necessarily the strongest Alolan form that we have today, but considering we were working off of base Raticate, I think this is a pretty huge step up from the very terrible early Rat Pokemon. For Alolan Raichu on the other hand, we really don't need to do much to make this Pokemon viable. For starters, we already have almost 500 BST anyway, so we're going to take 15 points and throw them into its special attack, raising this from 95 to 110 base special attack. We don't really need to do much else to improve the stats, and I think the better change is going to be reworking how Surge Surfer works, by also allowing it to not only double its speed in electric terrain, but also in the psychic terrain. Considering we already have the Quark Drive Pokemon from these future paradoxes that'll be able to boost stats that they want to, such as speed or an offense next to Pokemon like Miraidon and Pincurchin, I don't exactly think that Alolan Raichu with its very terrible stat line is going to be competing in this regard with the Quark Drive picks. So I want to also allow it to double its speed next to a Pokemon like Indeedee, which is a much more unique role here. Considering this can now slot on both Psy Spam and Electric Spam teams, this will be a very powerful addition to your roster. And Alolan Raichu already actually has Expanding Force, which is the key move that Psy Spam win cons such as Armourouge have used all generation to win games. Just for good measure though, I want to also give Alolan Raichu Rising Voltage because this move will be very impactful when you do want to actually partner this with Miraidon, allowing you a second electric type that'll be able to break through opponents in case of Miraidon needs to click another stab such as Drake or Meteor. Speaking of speed boosting Alolan forms, let's talk about Alolan Sandslash. Despite its horrendous typing, I don't actually think it needs that much to improve itself in VGC. Alolan Sandslash is going to be one of 3 Pokemon that will go above 500 BST for, and we'll be raising this to 505 BST as I'd like to think this mirrors Alolan Ninetales pretty well, and Alolan Ninetales actually already has 505 BST. Seeing as these are meant to be the snow duo, I feel like this fits pretty well, and we'll be using these 5 extra points that we'll be working with to throw these into special defense. We still do have another 50 points invested into Alolan Sandslash though, and we'll be giving 30 points to its attack and 20 points of speed, which should make this into a very terrifying snow sweeper. As for moves, I want to add on a Roar Veil and Fake Out, which will be 2 very impactful support moves to Alolan Sandslash. And just for good measure, let's also give it high horsepower as a strong way to deal some powerful ground type damage to any steel or fire types that might wall your dual stab. I could honestly see this being a very terrifying Terra user if we had this version of Alolan Sandslash in Scarlet and Violet, but I still think that, to be fair, with these buffs, it'll be a very powerful option in future generations, as with the snow now boosting its physical defense, this actually would have a reason to be run on your team. As I mentioned already, we're not buffing Alolan Ninetales, so we're kind of done with the snow forms for the Alola region, and we're going to move right on to Alolan Dugtrio, the other steel type Alolan form. Now, Alolan Dugtrio is honestly probably the worst Alolan form in VGC, and I would argue it's the only one that's a complete downgrade from its Kanto counterpart. Considering you're now 10 base speed slower and you have a significant worse set of abilities, this Pokemon just not that good, and even options like Alolan Raticate at least have a new secondary stab. You could argue at least gives them a niche over their Kanto forms. Let's start off by replacing the very useless ability in Sand Force with the new ability Inner Focus, which will help Alolan Dugtrio avoid things like Intimidate and Fake Out, both of which are very easy ways to counter it. With a base stat total of 425, we have an extra 75 points to work with, which we're going to be using to focus mostly towards attack and HP. We also did improve both its physical defense and speed by 10 points, which should help Alolan Dugtrio actually match the Kanto form in speed, and also just get a little bit of extra bulk. Speaking of, because Alolan Dugtrio is going to need a much stronger ground stab since it is an offensive ground typing, we're going to give it both high horsepower and headlong rush, which should essentially give it 2 very powerful options that it can actually finally deal damage with, considering Rillaboom is one of the best Pokemon and it sets grassy terrain, which will weaken moves like Earthquake for it. Finally, just to make sure Alolan Dugtrio doesn't lose to Trick Room teams, I want to also add on Taunt, which should be a really big deal for such a fast Pokemon. With just 5 Alolan forms left, we have options that for the most part will require substantially less changes to improve, with our first case of this being Alolan Persian. We're going to start by changing the ability from Rattled to Prankster. While I don't know if Prankster will be used over abilities like Fur Coat and Technician, at the same time, I think this is at least a third viable branch of abilities that could definitely at least see play on certain teams. This will at least improve moves like Parting Shot and Quash that could both actually have a lot of potential with the +1 priority, but I still think that it has a pretty even set of abilities with both Technician and Fur Coat, and this is just another way to make it viable. For our stat points, we have a lot to work with here, and we're going to start by raising a special attack from base 75 to 115, and this 40-point improvement will be huge when pairing it with Technician sets to boost the damage of moves like Snarl and Icy Wind. We're going to also give it 20 more points into its special defense, since for these Fur Coat sets, you're already going to have some pretty incredible physical bulk anyway, so with the 20 points going strictly into special defense here, this should help make Alolan Persian significantly bulkier. As for moves, Alolan Persian actually has an incredible move pool already, so I just want to add on 2 different options, both Super Fang and Clear Smog, which should help Alolan Persian get past really bulky walls that otherwise would fail to KO. And with Clear Smog, you can stop a lot of these setup win cons or Dozagiri teams that would otherwise get past you pretty quickly. I think these moves will at least help Alolan Persian stand on its own as a pure dark type, which is pretty difficult to do in Scarlet and Violet since a lot of the best dark types all have a secondary stab. But I think with the buffs that we've given Alolan Persian today, it could actually hold its own. Now, Alolan Golem has pretty horrendous stab optimizations, considering it's a Pokemon with a really strong offensive typing that is also very slow. Considering you can't even consistently get off your galvanized explosions, what is this Pokemon really actually meant to do in doubles? Because of this, we already are going to give Alolan Golem a 5 extra base increase to its speed, bringing it up to base 50. And we're going to also move an additional 30 points from its physical defense to its speed stat as well, bringing this up to a total of base 80 speed. While I do think this Pokemon would probably need to be faster for most teams, at the same time though, I only can make it so fast without just cutting its defenses entirely, and considering it's a clump of rocks, I think any more cuts to its physical defense would be pretty heinous. I want to also change out its ability Magnet Pull and instead give it No Guard, which should help out a lot with moves like Rock Slide in case for some reason you don't want to run the Galvanized movesets, and making sure these moves always land will be a pretty big deal here. Finally, I want to also add on the move Fake Out, which will be a great option to fake out different ghost type Pokemon with the ability Galvanize, since they would otherwise be completely immune to the move. While you will still have to worry about ground type Pokemon having an immunity to Fake Out, at the same time though, if you partner this with a Pokemon like Rillaboom, these ground types will have no chance against against you, and you won't have to worry about getting the Fake Out pressure off. And you still could use Fake Out if you wanted to on non-galvanized sets, and Fake Out these ground types that would otherwise wall the move entirely. I think this version of Alolan Golem honestly could have had some genuine niche in VGC, but for now though, we have to suffer with a significantly worse option that has no niche in doubles in general, whereas at least this version could have thrown on a choice scarf and won a lot of games on League. Now, one of the best Alolan forms in Scarlet and Violet is easily Alolan Muk, and while I would argue that it has at least some niche in best of 1 formats, I wouldn't call it a consistent threat in Generation 9 by any means. I want to change 2 things here really quickly, with the first being a small reduction to its speed. We're going to move 10 points from its speed and give them to its physical defense, which should allow Alolan Muk to underpace threats like Kingambit, Iron Hands, and the Ursalunas, which in combination with Terastal will be a very big deal for it. I also want to give Alolan Muk the move Recover, since in its debut generation of Sun and Moon, Alolan Muk had the Super Berries as really strong ways to heal itself up. However, the HP buff that these berries did give Alolan Muk has since been reduced significantly, and I think a move like Recover at least will help it still keep up its health, especially considering we have so much better win cons than we did offensively speaking than we did in Generation 7. Outside of these 2 buffs, I don't really think Alolan Muk needs much else to be viable again in VGC, since it's already just barely a good Pokemon, and with options like Recover and a slightly better defensive stat, this will actually be a good Pokemon again. Now, similar to Alolan Golem, Alolan Exeggutor was a pretty big misstep for whoever designed it, and I truly think it is one of 2 Pokemon that was completely worse in its Kanto form, similar to how Alolan Dugtrio was worse than Kanto Dugtrio. Now, I learned just a few weeks ago that Alolan Exeggutor actually doesn't even have Chlorophyll, which I was genuinely surprised by. So we're going to change out Frisk, which is now useless in these best of 3 formats with Team Sheet Preview, and instead give it the ability Chlorophyll. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are going to expect me to change the typing from Grass Dragon, but I actually think it's a pretty cool offensive typing, and instead what I want to do is improve the speed in Alolan Exeggutor. However, with 530 points in its base stat total, we're just going to have to move around 30 points from its physical attack to speed in order to at least make sure it has a base 75 speed stat. Now, this isn't exactly too impressive compared to threats like Venusaur and Hisui Lilligant, but it is substantially better. And with a unique typing offensively, this at least could still have merit over both. I also want to give Alolan Exeggutor Earth Power, as this will help with damaging opposing fire types that'll wall both your grass stab, as well as the fire coverage that you will be trying to boost with your Sun Up, so I think at the very least, this will be a very good pick for Alolan Exeggutor, and it might actually make it a finally viable Pokemon. Finally, we have the Alolan form that I would argue was one of the most central in the VGC 2017 format, being Alolan Marowak. Now, this Pokemon was really viable in VGC 2017, as it was one of the only ways you could have a resistance to both of Tapu Koko stabs, and Tapu Koko was the best Pokemon in that year. Since then though, Alolan Marowak has really not seen usage in VGC, and I think because of this, I want to make sure it's at least viable again, since while Scarlet and Violet it could have been okay with Terra, I don't really see it being used too much in Generation 10 onward. Now, because of its signature item Thick Club, which doubles Alolan Marowak's attack stat, essentially just giving it huge power as an item slot, I do want to be very careful about its stat points here, so we're going to break the rule of the 500 BST total again, and only give Alolan Marowak very minimal stat boost, raising its BST to 445. We are going to start off by moving 20 points from its speed to HP, which should allow it to underpace Pokemon like Amoonguss, which is a really big deal for Trick Room teams, as Alolan Marowak's Dual Stab will be very impactful to break through this Pokemon with very little effort. We're also going to give it an extra 10 points to both its physical attack and special defense, which honestly is mostly just going to be here to give it a little bit of an extra oomph when it comes to all these new very powerful Pokemon that Scarlet and Violet introduced. Now, I don't think the jump from base 80 to base 90 attack is going to be game-changing for Alolan Marowak, but it will be a pretty significant increase, and I think this will at least help you allocate points to other stats. As far as an ability goes, because Tapu Koko isn't in Scarlet and Violet, I want to find a way to make it still really strong in this generation. So we're going to change out Cursed Body for Shadow Shield, which should help a lot with at least this very underwhelming base stat total defensively speaking, and I think this will at least have a far easier time using this as a really good defensive piece if you don't care about Lightning Rod. Now, I do want to add on 2 moves for Alolan Marowak before we end off its buffs, with the first being Shadow Sneak, which should help a lot when you don't have Trick Room on the field. However, for situations where you don't have another Trick Room setter on your team, I do want to also give Alolan Marowak the move Trick Room, which is a much needed option on a Pokemon like this, especially considering we now have given it the ability Shadow Shield, which will help it actually sustain this move very easily, since its added bulk with the essential multi-scale it's now being provided will be a very huge deal. This is going to be a huge improvement over Pokemon like Dusclops, which has a similar speed stat to Alolan Marowak, but significantly worse offensive stats, or an option like Chandelure, for example, which while it has similar offensive capabilities, at the same time though, it is significantly faster in PGC. I think you could finally actually justify Alolan Marowak as an outright meta staple with moves like this, and overall, I'm curious to see how this and the rest of the Alolan forms would do this generation. If you guys want to see me cover other Pokemon though in VGC, if we get this video to 300 likes, I'll do another. And for now, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that upcoming video. Also, if you want to vote on the next topic we do like this, consider becoming a member. As for just a couple dollars a month, you guys get to vote on topics just like this for future videos. Our current members are Josh Gay Ultra Player, Zeke Zero, and Blood Lily. Thank you guys very much for the support on these videos. It really does mean the world. Finally, I want to give a huge shout out to Dose, who edited today's video, as well as Becca, who helps out with a lot of other content on the channel. Both of their links are going to be in the description below, and I would love it if you guys could check them out. With that said, I'll see you guys in next week's video. Until then, peace out, guys.